The dust swirled across the parched trail as Lorna Verona struggled beneath the weight of the firewood she'd gathered, her wedding dress dragging in the dirt behind her. Married only yesterday to a man she barely knew, abandoned today at their camp while he went hunting. This wasn't the life she'd imagined when she'd agreed to travel west as a mail-order bride. Wyoming Territory, 1878, was proving to be far more challenging than any letter could have described. The late September air carried the first whisper of autumn's chill, but the sun still beat down mercilessly as Lorna made her way back to camp. She'd walked farther than intended, desperate to find adequate kindling in this sparse landscape. The bundle in her arms grew heavier with each step. Her new husband, Walter Davis, had instructed her to gather enough wood to last several days while he hunted. "A wife must earn her keep," he'd said coldly before riding off, leaving her alone at their makeshift camp between Cheyenne and Laramie. 23-year-old Lorna had come west from Boston with dreams of adventure and a new beginning after losing her parents to influenza. The correspondence with Walter had seemed promising. He described himself as established, hardworking, and in need of a companion. The reality was a harsh, disagreeable man who'd shown nothing but contempt since meeting her at the station 2 days ago. A sharp pain shot through Lorna's lower back. She staggered, trying to maintain her balance as black spots danced before her eyes. She hadn't eaten since morning a stale biscuit and lukewarm coffee. Walter had taken most of their provisions with him. "Just a bit further," she gasped, willing herself to continue, her vision blurred. The weight became unbearable. With a soft cry, Lorna collapsed to her knees, the firewood scattering across the dusty trail. She tried to rise but found herself sinking instead, consciousness fading as the sound of approaching hoofbeats reached her ears. Xavier Quincy pulled back on his horse's reins, spotting a figure collapsed on the trail ahead. At first he thought it might be a trap. Bandits weren't uncommon in these parts, but as he drew closer, he saw it was a young woman sprawled amid scattered firewood, wearing what appeared to be a wedding dress, now soiled and torn. "Madam," he called cautiously, dismounting with fluid grace. At 30, Xavier had spent half his life in the saddle, working cattle drives across the territory. His tall frame cast a long shadow as he approached, hand resting instinctively on his holstered revolver. When she didn't respond, he knelt beside her, noting her shallow breathing. Gently, he turned her over. Her face was pale beneath a smattering of freckles, her auburn hair falling loose from what had once been an elaborate arrangement. "Miss, can you hear me?" Xavier touched her wrist, checking her pulse. It fluttered rapidly beneath his calloused fingers. Lorna's eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes the color of prairie grass after rain. "The wood," she murmured. "I need to gather it." "Don't you worry about the wood," Xavier said, pulling his canteen from his saddle. He lifted her head slightly, pressing the container to her lips. "Small sips now." The water revived her somewhat. Lorna struggled to sit up, embarrassment coloring her cheeks as she became aware of the stranger's presence. "I'm so sorry to trouble you, sir. I just got a bit lightheaded." "No trouble, madam." Xavier surveyed their surroundings. "You're a fair piece from anywhere." "Where's your camp, your husband?" His eyes flickered to her wedding dress and back to her face. Lorna's expression tightened. "About a mile back near the creek bend. My husband is hunting." She attempted to stand but swayed dangerously. Xavier steadied her with a strong hand. "You're in no condition to be carrying anything, let alone a load of firewood." He began gathering the scattered pieces. "I'll help you back and get this wood to your camp." "I couldn't impose," Lorna began. "It's no imposition. I was heading that direction anyway," he lied smoothly. In truth, he'd been making for Laramie, but something about this woman's situation troubled him. Within minutes, Xavier had secured the firewood to his horse and helped Lorna onto the saddle. He led the animal on foot, watching her carefully to ensure she didn't fall. "I'm Lorna Verona," she offered after a moment of silence. "Well, Lorna Davis now, I suppose." "Xavier Quincy," he replied. "Most folks call me Zav. You're newly married then?" "Yesterday." Her voice held no joy at the declaration. Xavier nodded, keeping his thoughts to himself. You from around these parts, Boston? I came west as a, she hesitated, mail-order bride. Xavier supplied gently. Lorna nodded, shame evident in her downcast eyes. It seemed like an adventure. My parents died last winter and I had little to keep me there. No shame in seeking a new beginning, Xavier said. Though I reckon any man who sends his new bride to gather firewood alone might not be the gentleman he claimed in those letters. They continued in companionable silence, until Lorna pointed out the camp, a small clearing beside a creek with a single tent and the remains of a morning fire. Xavier helped her down and set about arranging the firewood properly. He noticed the meager supplies, the single blanket inside the tent, visible through the open flap. Everything spoke of a man who'd made minimal preparations for a bride. When did your husband leave? Xavier asked, striking a match to kindle a small fire. Dawn, Lorna replied, sinking gratefully onto a fallen log. He said he'd be back by nightfall. Xavier glanced at the sun, already beginning its descent. You've had nothing to eat since morning. Lorna's silence was answer enough. With efficient movements, Xavier reached into his saddlebag and produced jerky, hardtack, and a small tin of coffee. I can't accept, she started. You can and you will, Xavier interrupted firmly. No neighbor in these parts would let another go hungry. As he prepared a simple meal, Xavier studied Lorna covertly. Despite her bedraggled appearance, there was a quiet dignity in her bearing, a resilience that impressed him. Boston ladies weren't known for their hardiness, yet here she was, attempting to make the best of what was clearly a bad situation. How long have you been in the territory? Lorna asked as Xavier handed her a tin cup of coffee. Born in Missouri, but I've been out here since I was 15, he replied. Worked most of the big outfits from Texas to Montana, currently riding for the Circle J about 20 miles east of here. You're a long way from home then, Xavier shrugged. The trail is my home. Was headed to Laramie for supplies when I found you. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. Lorna tensed visibly, her knuckles whitening around the cup. A bearded man rode into the clearing, a brace of rabbits hanging from his saddle. His eyes narrowed at the sight of Xavier. Who the hell are you? The man demanded, hand dropping to his gun. Xavier rose slowly, hands visible. Xavier Quincy. I was passing by when I found your wife collapsed on the trail, helped her back with the firewood. Walter Davis dismounted, his gaze shifting between Xavier and Lorna. That true, woman, Lorna nodded, standing shakily. Mr. Quincy was kind enough to didn't ask for his life story, Walter snapped. He jerked his head toward Xavier. You've done your good deed. Now ride on. Xavier remained motionless, measuring the man before him. Walter Davis was shorter but stocky, with a mean set to his mouth and bloodshot eyes that suggested he'd been drinking from the flask visible in his pocket. Your wife needs food and rest, Xavier said evenly. She's exhausted. My wife is my concern, Walter countered. Not yours, Xavier nodded slightly. Indeed she is. A man should take good care of what's his. The words were neutral, but the implication clear. Walter's face darkened. You suggesting I don't? I'm suggesting it's getting late and I should be on my way. Xavier turned to Lorna. Thank you for your hospitality, Mrs. Davis. Lorna's eyes betrayed her fear at his departure, but she managed a polite nod. Thank you for your assistance, Mr. Quincy. Xavier mounted his horse, tipping his hat to Lorna before riding slowly away. He'd gone perhaps 50 yards when he heard raised voices, followed by the sharp sound of a slap. He reined in his horse, indecision warring within him. It wasn't his place to interfere between husband and wife. Yet the fear in Lorna's eyes haunted him. Night had fallen completely by the time Xavier made camp a mile downstream. He'd decided against continuing to Laramie, troubled by the situation he'd left behind. As he sat before his small fire, the sound of footsteps approaching sent his hand to his revolver. Mr. Quincy? Lorna's voice trembled in the darkness. Xavier rose quickly. Mrs. Davis, what are you doing here? She stepped into the firelight, a bruise darkening one cheek, her lips split and swollen. I can't stay with him, he's not. He's not what was promised. Anger surged through Xavier, but he kept his voice calm. Where is he now? Passed out. He had a bottle in his saddlebag. Lorna wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite the fire's warmth. I know I have no right to ask, but could you help me get to Laramie? I have a little money. I can pay for passage back east. Xavier guided her to sit by the fire, draping his spare blanket around her shoulders. Of course I'll help you, but you should know he might come after you. Legally, you're his wife. A marriage based on lies is no marriage at all, Lorna said with unexpected firmness. He presented himself as a respectable rancher. In truth, he's a drunkard with no property to speak of. He admitted tonight he gambled away his homestead claim months ago. Xavier nodded slowly. We'll head for Laramie at first light. For now, rest. You're safe here. He offered her his bedroll, fashioning a crude pallet for himself on the opposite side of the fire. As Lorna drifted into exhausted sleep, Xavier kept vigil, one ear attuned to sounds from upstream. Dawn broke with no sign of Walter Davis. Xavier and Lorna broke camp quickly, eager to put distance between themselves and the man who might or might not pursue them. How did you end up a cowboy? Lorna asked as they rode double on Xavier's horse, her arms tentatively circling his waist. Xavier smiled, though she couldn't see it. My father was a farmer in Missouri, too many mouths to feed, not enough land. When I was 15, a cattle drive came through. The trail boss needed extra hands and I signed on, never looked back. Do you ever miss having a home? Lorna's voice was soft against his back. Xavier considered the question. Sometimes, but the open country has its own kind of beauty. The stars overhead, the land stretching to the horizon. There's freedom in it. I think I understand, Lorna said after a moment. I felt trapped in Boston after my parents died, teaching at a girls' school, living in a boarding house with other spinsters. When I saw the advertisement seeking brides for the West, it seemed like an escape. From one cage to another, Xavier observed. Yes. Her arms tightened slightly around him. Though this one proved far worse than the one I left. They rode through the morning, stopping briefly to rest the horse and share a simple meal from Xavier's provisions. Lorna's quiet competence impressed him. She gathered water, helped prepare food, and asked intelligent questions about the territory they passed through. You adapt quickly, Xavier commented as they mounted up again. Lorna smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. My father always said I was stubborn as a mule. Mother called it determination. Both admirable qualities out here, Xavier replied, enjoying the sound of her soft laughter. By mid-afternoon, dark clouds gathered on the horizon. Xavier frowned at the sky. Storm's brewing, we should find shelter. There's an old line shack about an hour's ride from here, if memory serves. The first fat raindrops began to fall as the small cabin came into view. Xavier urged the horse forward, reaching the shelter just as the skies opened in earnest. The line shack was abandoned but sound, with a small stove, rough-hewn table, and single cot. Xavier busied himself lighting the stove while Lorna stood awkwardly in the center of the room. It's not much, Xavier apologized, but it'll keep us dry. It's perfectly adequate, Lorna assured him. She hesitated. Mr. Quincy, Xav, he corrected gently. Xav, she amended, I want to thank you. Not many men would have helped as you have. Xavier shrugged, suddenly self-conscious under her direct gaze. Any decent man would have done the same. No, Lorna said firmly. They wouldn't have. I've learned that lesson well. Outside, thunder rolled across the plains, punctuating her words. Rain lashed against the single small window, creating an intimate cocoon around them. Xavier cleared his throat. You should take the cot. I'll make do on the floor. Lorna nodded but made no move toward the bed. Instead, she came closer to the stove, to Xavier. In the dim light, the bruise on her cheek stood out starkly against her pale skin. Without thinking, Xavier reached out, his fingers hovering just above the mark. Does it hurt much? Not anymore, Lorna whispered. Something in her voice made Xavier's heart beat faster. They stood like that, barely breathing, the storm raging outside mirroring the tumult within. Then, with a boldness that surprised them both, Lorna leaned forward and pressed her lips gently to his. Xavier remained perfectly still, afraid to break the fragile moment. When she pulled back, her eyes searched his face. "I shouldn't have done that," she whispered. "No," he agreed, "but I'm glad you did." This time, it was Xavier who closed the distance between them, his kiss gentle, mindful of her injured lip. Lorna responded with unexpected fervor, her hands clutching at his shirt. When they parted, both breathless, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "This is madness. You're married, even if it's to a scoundrel." "A marriage I intend to annul at the first opportunity," Lorna replied. "But you're right, this is complicated." With visible effort, Xavier stepped back, creating distance between them. "We should rest. Tomorrow will be a long day." They settled into an uneasy truce, Xavier on the floor, Lorna on the cot, both acutely aware of the other's presence as the storm howled through the night. Morning brought clearing skies and renewed purpose. They said little about the kiss they'd shared, focusing instead on the practical matters of reaching Laramie safely. "We should arrive by midday," Xavier said as they rode out. "The sheriff there is a good man. He'll help you file the necessary papers." Lorna nodded, her arms once more around Xavier's waist, though now the touch carried added significance. "And after that," Xavier hesitated. "That depends on what you want, Lorna." "Freedom," she said without hesitation, "and perhaps a second chance at happiness." Xavier smiled, covering her hand with his own. "Wyoming's a good place for both." They'd ridden for perhaps an hour when Xavier stiffened. "Riders coming," he said quietly. "3 of them." Lorna's arms tightened around him. "Walter, can't tell yet, but I don't like the odds." Xavier urged his horse off the trail, seeking the cover of a small copse of trees. "Stay here. Keep low." He dismounted, helping Lorna down before drawing his revolver. The approaching riders came into view, Walter Davis, accompanied by 2 rough-looking men. "That's them," Walter shouted, pointing. "That's the bastard who stole my wife." The 3 men spurred their horses toward the trees. Xavier positioned himself in front of Lorna. "Stay behind me," he instructed. "If things go badly, take my horse and ride hard for Laramie." "I won't leave you," Lorna protested. "You will if I tell you to," Xavier said firmly. "Promise me." Before she could respond, Walter and his companions reached the tree line, dismounting with weapons drawn. "You've got something that belongs to me, cowboy," Walter snarled. Xavier's expression remained impassive. "Mrs. Davis came to me of her own accord after you struck her. I'm escorting her to Laramie where she can decide her own fate." One of Walter's companions, a scar-faced man with yellowed teeth, spat on the ground. "Woman's property, same as a horse. You stole her, you thief." "I'm not property," Lorna said, stepping up beside Xavier despite his attempt to keep her back. "And our marriage was based on your lies, Walter." Walter's face contorted with rage. "Shut your mouth, woman, you made vows." To a man who claimed to be a respectable rancher, not a drunk who gambled away everything he owned. Lorna's voice was steady, though Xavier could see her trembling. "This doesn't need to turn ugly," Xavier said calmly. "We're all going to Laramie anyway. Let the sheriff and the law decide." Walter sneered. "I got a better idea. Me and my friends here decide right now." His hand twitched toward his gun. Xavier was faster. His revolver cleared its holster in one smooth motion, aimed squarely at Walter's chest. "Don't," he warned. A tense silence fell over the clearing. Walter's companions shifted nervously, their own weapons half drawn. 3 against 1, cowboy, Walter said, though with less confidence than before. "True," Xavier acknowledged. "But you'll be the first to die. Is she worth that?" Indecision flickered across Walter's face, followed by calculation. His eyes darted to Lorna, then back to Xavier. "Maybe we can work something out, man to man." "I'm listening," Xavier said cautiously. $200. Cash money for the annulment papers signed." Walter grinned unpleasantly. "She ain't worth the trouble anyway." Lorna gasped in outrage. Xavier's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. That's between you and Mrs. Davis. If she agrees to terms, I've no objection. Walter glared at Lorna. Well, $200 to be rid of me. Fair price. I have $50 to my name, Lorna said coldly. You know that. It was in my trunk. Which is mine by right, Walter countered. Xavier had heard enough. Here's how it's going to be. We're all riding to Laramie. Mrs. Davis will speak to the sheriff and a judge. If they determine an annulment is warranted, so be it. If they say she owes you compensation, she'll pay what she can. Walter's hand strayed toward his gun again. Or I could just shoot you and take her back. You could try, Xavier said evenly, but like I said, you'd be the first to die. Something in Xavier's tone, the cold certainty of a man who'd faced down trouble before, seemed to penetrate Walter's bravado. He glanced at his companions, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. Fine, Walter spat finally. Laramie, but this ain't over, Cowboy. The tense procession that made its way to Laramie drew curious stares from passers-by. Xavier and Lorna rode together, Walter and his friends following at a distance. Sheriff James Morgan listened carefully to both sides of the story, his weathered face betraying nothing. When they'd finished, he nodded slowly. Mrs. Davis, I'll escort you to Judge Wilson's office. He'll want to hear this directly. He turned to Walter. Mr. Davis, you and your friends will remain here. Any trouble and you'll spend the night in my jail. Walter glared but remained silent. 4 hours later, Lorna emerged from the judge's office, clutching a document in her hand, her face a mixture of relief and disbelief. He granted it, she said to Xavier, who'd been waiting anxiously outside. The annulment. The judge said Walter's misrepresentation of his circumstances and his violence constituted grounds. Xavier exhaled slowly. What about the money? I must return the $50 he paid for my train ticket. Lorna's smile was tentative. It seems I'm a free woman again, Mr. Quincy. Sheriff Morgan approached, nodding to them both. Davis has been informed of the judge's decision. He's not happy, but he's accepted the money and signed the papers. I've suggested he and his friends leave town promptly. Thank you, Sheriff, Xavier said, shaking the man's hand. Not necessary. Morgan's eyes twinkled. Always happy to help a lady in distress, and a fellow Missourian. After the sheriff departed, Xavier turned to Lorna. What will you do now? She looked up at him, her green eyes clear and direct. That depends on what opportunities might be available in Wyoming territory. Xavier smiled slowly. I hear the Circle J Ranch might be hiring a schoolteacher for the foreman's children. Owner's wife mentioned it just last week. Is that so? Lorna stepped closer. And where might I stay while pursuing such an opportunity? Town has a respectable boarding house for single ladies, Xavier said, his voice dropping lower. Though I'd call on you regularly with the owner's permission. I see, Lorna's smile widened. And what might be your intentions with these calls, Mr. Quincy? Xavier reached for her hand, engulfing it in his larger one. Honorable ones, Miss Verona, if you'd be interested in such. I might be, she whispered. In time we have, Xavier assured her. The West isn't going anywhere. 3 months later, on a crisp December morning, Xavier waited nervously outside the small church in Laramie. Inside, Lorna was preparing with the help of the doctor's wife and several other ladies who'd taken the former Boston teacher under their wing. Settle down, Quincy, Sheriff Morgan chuckled, adjusting his tie. She's not going to change her mind. Xavier smiled ruefully. Still seems too good to be true. A man doesn't expect to find his future wife collapsed beside a trail. Providence works in mysterious ways, the sheriff observed. Though I reckon you helped Providence along by being the kind of man who stops to help. The church door opened, and Xavier straightened as Lorna appeared in a simple but elegant ivory dress, far different from the bedraggled wedding gown he'd first seen her in. Her auburn hair was arranged with white winter roses, her cheeks flushed with happiness. As she walked toward him, Xavier reflected on the unlikely journey that had brought them here, from a chance encounter on a dusty trail to building a future together on the land he'd purchased near the Circle J, where Lorna now taught the ranch children 3 days a week. When she reached him, Xavier took her hands in his. Ready for another adventure, Miss Verona, Lorna's smile was radiant. With you, Mr. Quincy, always. As they spoke their vows before friends and neighbors, Xavier thought about the firewood he'd gathered that September day, never imagining he was also gathering the beginning of a life he'd never dared hope for, one filled with love, purpose, and the promise of home. Years later, when their children asked how they met, Xavier would wink at Lorna and say, "Your mother collapsed under the weight of some firewood, so I picked up her burden and never put it down." And Lorna would add, smiling, "And I took his heart in exchange." In the vast Wyoming territory, where fortunes were made and lost on the turn of a card or the whim of nature, they had found the rarest treasure of all, a love as enduring as the land itself, born from a simple act of kindness on a lonely western trail.